Welcome to another episode of the Reboot Chronicles, a no-holds-barred forum with global leaders, authors, entrepreneurs, and CEOs about how organizations stay focused on growth and innovation in unprecedented times. I'm your host, Dean DeBias, coming to you live from Reviv's North American headquarters in Chicago, and we would like to thank you for joining us from around the globe today. I'd like to welcome Janet Foutty, the Exec Chair at Deloitte US, the leading provider of consulting, financial, and risk advisory, tax and audit services, and other things that we'll talk about today. Now in their 175th year, it's really hard to believe, with over 47 billion in revenue and 330,000 employees spread around 150 countries. Janet and her teammates work with approximately 70% of the global 500s. It's like Fortune 500s, but global one list is a little different. And over 5,000 to 7,000 private companies as well. So Janet, welcome. It's good to see you today.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here with you today, Dean.
Whenever I read the stats of Deloitte, I'm just blown away because growing up in Chicago and watching you guys grow, and this is clearly not your, your father's Big Four accounting firm anymore. So who are you now?
So, Dean, thank you for that gracious introduction. And again, it is terrific to be with you. Terrific to be with you today. I'll start by saying we're the largest professional services firm in the world. And as you highlighted in your introduction, we have a really broad set of services. Our history and our roots, going back hard to think about 175 years, were clearly in helping create the audit profession. But we've had the privilege building from that foundation of really helping our clients solve their most complex and sophisticated problems and challenges and opportunities that they have across a really wide set of disciplines. And that's what's really formed sort of the foundation of who we are today. You know, making an impact that matters has been our sort of way we think about our business for a really long time, and that's for our people, our clients, and society. But that does look very different today, even through the 30 years which I've had the privilege to work and help lead Deloitte.
Yeah, good start. I was reading your 2020 earnings release, and I was pretty impressed with, well, for 47 billion, who wasn't impressed with that? But it said about half of the U.S. revenue at this point is coming from consulting, and then the category globally is up 7%, which is, in the pandemic era, that's actually pretty good. So some consultancy firms, the mid-tier ones, didn't do as well. So what is that? What is the consulting category?
Yeah, so prior to the role the firm and the board asked me to play as the executive chair, I had the opportunity to serve as the CEO and chair of Deloitte Consulting, so it's near and dear to my heart. And our consulting business is a really broad-based business with everything from high-end strategy services, both in the C-suite and the boardroom, through technology strategy, through technology implementation, to helping our clients think about their human capital strategy, to helping them when they need our help run their business. So it's a very broad set of services across advising, implementing, and helping run businesses across pretty much every domain you can think about, also across a pretty broad set of industries. I love your question about this is not your sort of father's Deloitte. And when I think about the consulting business started out of our audit business when our audit clients asked us for help solving business problems that weren't necessarily sitting in the center of their audit. Right. Obviously, it's grown and broadened tremendously, but the people side is what's really remained the same. For us, focus on people has been an incredible part of our legacy and our brand. But the types of people we hire today, both in our consulting business as well as broadly, look very different. We used to just have CPAs, and then we had CPAs and MBAs and then undergrad, but now we have scientists and physicians and lawyers and quants and creatives. So a really broad set of people who help sort of focus on the solutions that our clients are looking for.
Yeah, and it's really competitive out there. I mean, if you look at, not all the big four, but, one of the other ones is just going crazy on digital acquisitions and things. You actually started Deloitte Digital, didn't you?
I did. I'm personally a sort of Wall Street quant type by background. I'm about as back office as you can get. But I was leading our technology business, and I had a team that started to push there in my thinking about what could, taking the consumer technologies that we were getting so familiar with, what could those look like if those were really in the hands of governments and corporate America? And that was the genesis of Deloitte Digital. It started with a really small acquisition of a company called Ubermind based in Seattle. And again, as a Wall Street back office person, I went out to Seattle and sat down with them. I was totally overdressed, by the way, for spending time in the digital space in Seattle.
Yeah.
But I fell in love with their vision for what taking digital technologies could mean for both the way corporations and governments interfaced with their customers and consumers and constituents and each other. And that was really the genesis of Deloitte Digital.
And then you picked up Dublin and all kinds of things, which
we did, yes.
I actually teach the 10 types of innovation in one of my college classes.
Okay, we can do a whole separate podcast on
totally. Yeah, I just went too
innovation
geeky.
in Dublin.
We just lost half the audience there. They're like, what is he talking about?
It's a good topic. You should do a session on it for sure for your audience here.
I actually love that idea. Well, cool. Thanks for the overview. It really helps. So we were going to kind of jump into DEI today. Those of you listening, diversity, equity, and inclusion around the world. It's kind of on the hot front burner in the United States, and the category is interesting. There's always been a lot of talk about it, but now we're seeing a lot more action. The work that I do with National Association of Corporate Directors, so we're seeing it all the way from boards all the way down to frontline, and I'm not always in line with what the strategies are with some of these companies, but I just thought I'd get your perspective, just as a kind of an independent Switzerland kind of consulting background versus you don't have to be in one camp or one industry because they all have different levels of this. But yeah, maybe just to kick us off, give us a sense of your perspective around what's going on with DEI.
So it's really well researched and sort of clarified and confirmed that DEI, and I'm sure we'll sort of parse apart all three parts of that, adds value. And the data and the research is really, really clear and persuasive. That those companies that have diverse and inclusive cultures provide a competitive edge over their peers. Boards, something you and I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about. We know that when you compare low and high performing boards, those are deemed high performing, are more likely to exhibit gender balance, inclusive behaviors. And I certainly see it in my professional services world. You said we're Switzerland, but it's really clear that though we've been talking about it for a long time as something that's important for the reasons we just highlighted, but today our clients expect it, our people expect it, and drawing the best talent only makes us stronger and more fit to lead. So it absolutely adds value, but it's really also about values. And though the sort of the sort of quick line that it's good and good for business, I think is a good adage, because if you only looked at sort of the financial and direct business value of including women or Black and other racially and ethnically diverse individuals in corporate leadership roles or boardrooms, it is good for business, but I don't think that's the mindset with which we should be thinking about what's fair and inclusive. Because the goodness that comes into society for being what's good for business, I think is really the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah.
And the more doors and opportunities we can create, families benefit, communities benefit, the economy benefits, and maybe most importantly, the next generation benefits. So
Right.
there is a lot sort of packed in that, but I personally, and we certainly see a shift in the conversation to broaden the aperture of how we're thinking about DEI.
Yeah, like you say, adds value and values. That's I'm going to use that one. But it used to just be I would just talk about diversity and inclusion. Then they threw equity in there. Why is that important? What's going on?
So I'll maybe use a little Deloitte history.
That's somewhat of a rhetorical question, but I just
it's a good question.
It just inserted itself this year. It seems like
we spent a lot of time thinking and talking about that over the last year, because the equity word sort of came into the conversation quite quickly. Diversity has a lot of roots. So I won't go back 175 years, but back in the early 90s, as I was starting my career in professional services, Deloitte had the privilege of being the first professional services firm to have a women's initiative and really start the diversity conversation.
Yes.
That then over the years evolved to be diversity and inclusion. How do you create an inclusive workforce and inclusive behaviors? But what we've really learned just over the last sets of years is that focusing on diversity and inclusion isn't enough. We have not moved the needle enough, whether that's in the boardroom, in corporate America, in our country, in government. And we've really come to understand that equity is not about an initiative or program, but it's about an outcome. And it's really about dismantling the systems, whether they're in an organization or a community, that uphold the inequities that we've seen. And it's about, and this is the key for me, it's about lasting economic and social outcomes and leveling the playing field. So equity is not to minimize or trivialize diversity and inclusion. You really need all three in order to have this lasting effect that we've been working on for many decades, and frankly, that we've moved the needle not enough.
So it's almost like, there's been all types of initiatives at the board level. Let's jump into that in a second. But the last thing you said, the word sustainability clicked into my mind. It seems like it's locking in more of a sustainable trajectory. Because what I've seen in some companies and boards is it's since the 90s, I can't remember what year, it started with financial reforms, and then we've done cybersecurity, and then we've always have these initiatives, and then they kind of go away. We either fix them or it's not a big issue. But by the way, all three of those are still big issues.
I was going to say, I don't think any of those have gone away.
But, there's always some massive thing that happens, Sarbanes-Oxley, and then cybersecurity stuff.
It creates the next imperative, right?
Yeah, it's like I'm not sure I see the urgency in this everywhere. For instance, if I look at Silicon Valley, a so-so track record on diversity, inclusion, and I won't even get into equity. Really, what's your scorecard, I guess, when you look at companies in the tech world?
So I think that the moment that we're in has absolutely changed the conversation, and I think sort of the transparency and the accountability that's been created in this moment that we're in. We do believe, and I do believe, is this idea of a movement, not just a moment. And that's the language that I'm certainly seeing in a lot of my governance-centric conversations.
Right.
And I do believe accountability starts with the board and with the CEO in terms of the long-term results and long-term commitment. But the transparency that's been created by this moment, I'll just use our own organization as an example, I think is where we will create sustained change. So we published for the very first time this year a transparency report.
I saw that. Very impressive.
We disaggregated our data. Disaggregating data is a critical part of this conversation that maybe we can pull the thread on. But we disaggregated our data about our own organization and set markers for our goals, both short-term and long-term, in a way that was, frankly, both exhilarating and humbling. We have a great history, but we have a long way to go. And so I do think transparency and accountability is critical. But the work that I've been doing, I've done some really interesting work with some academics as well, in terms of how do you create sustained change in the boardroom and in the C-suite? And I really do think it's about changing the questions that we ask. And Dean, as you just so well highlighted around Sarbanes, we started really changing the questions we were asking around a number of financial measures. Cyber has absolutely changed the way the boardroom has conversations around technology and the risks of technology, and is on almost every board agenda, if not every board agenda. So the work we're trying to do, both within our own boardroom and the conversations we're in with our clients, is how do you change the questions across a broad set of topics so that diversity, equity, inclusion sort of runs through the conversations that are in the boardroom. So for example, when you talk about M&A activity, because I think, by the way, diversity will always sit in the conversation around talent and workforce and pipeline. And it actually has well before this moment. But you think about M&A activity,
right.
Having the conversation about whether, and being deliberate about whether M&A activity is dilutive or accretive to the agenda that you have around diversity, I think is a really important question that is a board level question.
It's usually dilutive, but it's random. I've
Well,
found.
but having
Doing
a
a lot of it myself.
conversation and having that be, I mean, we probably don't have time today to talk about purpose and the role of purpose, but I do think this sort of sits in that sphere of conversation of ESG more broadly. I do think the ESG conversation is going to be sustainable, and DEI sitting as a really important thread there will create an ongoing conversation in the boardroom.
I like that. I went back and kind of tried to tally up how many women I've hired versus men over the last 15 years, specifically board roles, and it was 80% women, 20% men. So I scored myself well.
Thank you.
It was just because I liked them as people and their talent, and we needed, it was more revolved around more what do we need and who are the best people to fill those jobs. Do you feel like that's the discussion going on in board searches, or is it more like, hey, we need to find people that are, let's just stick with D&I, they're diverse, and we want to get as diverse as possible. Do you think other things take a back seat sometimes because of that?
I think the conversation is absolutely evolving in terms of thinking about diversity as a box to be checked, or to your point, or a seat to be filled.
Better said,
first
yes.
of all, I think the research and the clarity that one of anything is not enough to move the conversation, because if it's one woman or one Black person on a board or an executive team, it's hard not to be, the women's voice or the Black voice versus the voice of the expertise and perspective, to your point, that you're bringing to the board. So we know that you need two of something, of whatever that is, to begin to move the conversation and allow the women in this case to have a loud and important and clear voice in the boardroom as anyone else would, as opposed to being the voice of the woman, so to speak. So I think that conversation is evolving. I also think the emphasis on, I love the way you framed sort of looking for the skills and capabilities and perspectives. I think moving away from at the sort of top corporate that it just needs to be CEOs at the top of the C-suite, that there's a broader set of skills and capabilities that are needed to make great decisions and counsel. You think back to my comment about the skills and capabilities we have within Deloitte Consulting being so much broader, or Deloitte Audit, by the way, being so much broader than it was even in the past decade. The skills and capabilities you need to solve the problems that our organizations are facing, the organizations that we serve on boards for, require so much more diverse sets of perspectives that I think that's opening the aperture in a very different way.
Yeah, I like that. I've noticed you used the word perspective, which is critical. So even companies like Walmart and others, are largest company in the world, right? Are they're making their boards more diverse. But the word diversity, I like the way some boards are changing the scope there. It's like that sometimes means I'm just putting a young millennial on this board because we are so old and stodgy, and it wasn't a minority or a woman. The lead thing was like, we need younger people involved, at least to give us a perspective. Or in some companies, we'll set up a kitchen cabinet that doesn't have governance. So diversity can be much broader than just the core agenda, which is something that we're trying to shift around it. What can companies and boards do, I guess, tactically now, just jumping on in to make this journey a little more effective?
So
and really affect long-term change, which is the thesis you're going after,
that is absolutely the thesis that we're going on. So I love your frame that diversity is more than just gender or racial diversity. Those are obviously critically important, but I think age, cognitive diversity, there's a really good set of research and thinking around how different voices around the table lead to best outcomes.
Yeah.
Transformational change is what I do for a living, and what I've helped my clients do for my entire career. So I'm just going to pull on that thread that you've given me the opening for. I think advancing equity, or diversity, equity, inclusion, all of them, is about two things that are pretty fundamental, that are about leadership accountability and influencing culture. And you think about any big change you're trying to drive, any transformational change, those are the things you come back to. Leadership accountability, which often is toned from the top, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that, and culture. And I think culture is really the hard part. What is, I think, in some ways more complex and more subtle is this idea of orthodoxies around culture and change around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So every organization that has its orthodoxies, it is a source of great strength for sure.
Right.
And the beliefs or ways of thinking largely go unchallenged in an organization, especially if organizations are viewed as successful by traditional metrics. And so we've gotten familiar over the last while that orthodoxies need to get challenged to drive innovation, something I know you have a lot of passion around, and to drive growth.
Right.
But I don't think there's been enough focus on challenging orthodoxies as it relates to how we think about diversity and inclusion. And I'll just give you a quick example that we've been working in our own organization on flipping, which is this notion of an unbiased meritocracy. And our organization as a professional services firm, like many organizations, sort of think of themselves in very high regard as an unbiased meritocracy. And that is deeply part of our DNA and our culture. The challenge is what meritocracies don't take into effect is not everyone is entering the system at the same place. And in some cases, even if you're coming in through the same campus program, your experience set can be wildly different entering an organization like ours, based on a variety of factors that have influenced how you got there.
Sure.
So that type of orthodoxy, I think, culturally is critical to flip. And then I'll just talk briefly about accountability. Tone does absolutely start at the top with the CEO and the board, full stop. And holding leaders accountable for change, both in the short term and as we were talking about in the long term. Some of this change does not happen quickly. So patience and accountability in the long term is critical. And then the last thing I'll say here, and I've touched on this again, and you can tell it's a hot topic of mine, is I think boards holding management teams responsible for disaggregating their data around diversity is so important. And we've been looking at diversity data as boards for a long time. But as I've sort of come to this idea of how you disaggregate the data, it's given me a very different perspective. And that's in traditional manners, as you can think of, in terms of making sure that you're looking at how is our hiring practices and how our promotion practice and compensation practices. But then you think about things like, I'll just use women as an example. How are your women in roles of influence over key business and P&L decisions, for example? So really starting to get underneath the macro data. Those are a few things we've been thinking about in terms of driving sustainable change.
That's what I liked about your report, because you exposed your data. Most companies they don't want to do that. They're so far behind, and we get that a little bit, but if you can't measure it and benchmark it, you got a great story. You started from a bad position and you're moving forward. You bring up a good word here. I've never taken so many notes during a podcast. So those of you that are watching, the camera angle on me is very disorienting because I won't take the pen out of my hand today. So so the way I reboot companies or help people do it is, focus on people, platform, and passion. And I've seen some boards that do have a passion around this. I'll give you one example. So the CEO of Logitech, Bracken, he lives and breathes and sweats this stuff to the point where he will physically cry about how things need to change in this country, but he lives it and breathes it in the company and on social media and everywhere. It's like so authentic. I've never seen he's also a very ambivalent, friendly leader. So different style of a very decentralized company. He's got like 23 direct reports, unheard of for a
that's exhausting.
multi-billion-dollar company. I don't see a lot of that passion. These discussions are just like, this is the next initiative discussions, and the boards do need to keep a cool head and a long-term perspective. But how do you? There's a question in here somewhere. How do you get this level of passion up? I think you're your three things were like talent, market, and society. Were I don't know if it's related to this part of the discussion, but yeah, what can people do? Measuring is one. That's good.
So I do think most organizations, and this is maybe more a personal comment, do need to get sort of their spark wherever that comes from.
Right.
For us, we have a long history, but that can get tired, right? You can go. It can become a bit more sort of structured and sort of normal course versus passionate. To your point, we had the great privilege. There are a lot of wonderful organizations that are really focused on how do you change the conversation. And I had the ability to participate about a little less than 2 years ago, right before the start of the pandemic, in a conference that was sponsored by ELC, which is a wonderful organization that is focused on growing Black leaders. And I heard a woman speak there who was currently at JP Morgan Chase, talking about the challenges and opportunities and journey that JP Morgan Chase had gone through. Her name is Valerie Rainford, and I had come off a red eye, so you can imagine I was a little bit like, okay, I come off a red eye to go to this meeting. I know it's important. I'm here, but what am I really going to get out of this? And I listened to this woman speak, and I was mesmerized. So I called her, invited her to my office in New York to talk about the work that she had done. And I invited her to a board management offsite to spend a couple hours with us just sharing her story. And I can tell you that spark has generated so much energy and passion and commitment within our organization because she just caught our attention.
Yeah, she's very good. I've talked to her.
Yeah. But that's just an example. The one that
JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, I mean, he took it seriously. You and I know a lot of their executives. They live it and breathe it, which is great.
But so hearing the story from an executive, the story from an executive outside our organization about the journey they went through, what was difficult, what was straightforward, and we think we're pretty good at this, right? This is part of our history and who we are. Really sparks something. So for us, it is about people and talent and how we advance our own workforce and understanding where we have strength and where we have room to go. But it's also about marketplace. And I would say that shift is one that we're collectively as a business community are just starting to make. And that's in how we procure goods and services and holding ourselves accountable to a broader set of places where we procure goods and services, and how we build and tailor and market our own goods and services. In some ways more relevant in the B2C communities. You asked about tech earlier. I think a critical role that tech companies have to play is thinking about the products and services that they're building and delivering and looking at them through a lens of diversity and equity in particular.
Yeah, I was going to ask how can technology help here, but so it's more of an enabler, it sounds like. Yeah.
I do think, I'm a technologist by background.
Yeah.
I do think, like governance, technology is a critical enabler. How products get designed, which technologies are chosen to adopt. We've talked a lot about data today, and obviously technology sits at the heart of how you create data, transparency and accountability, how information flows, unconscious bias, which we haven't talked too much about today, and the ethical design and use of technology. Those are a whole set of threads that I think technology is an enabler, but strength and or great risk. And I spent a lot of time with CIOs and CTOs having really important and leading conversations on this topic.
Yeah, that could be a separate podcast. The bias in AI, that would be we probably need 4 hours to cover that.
We'd love to come talk to you about that, because we're spending a lot of time on that topic for sure.
I bet. Jan, I really want to thank you for joining us today. A lot of aspiring board members out there. Any advice for them to close out?
Three quick things. Our Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness spends a lot of time helping people sort of sort through this question, and they have three pieces of advice, which I will just share quickly, which is the first is network, network, network. 70 to 80% of board searches come from, or board placements come from individual networks. And so you use your own network, be vocal about the fact that you're interested in board service. I pull out a thread as you network that you and I have talked about today, Dean, which is passion. And that leads into knowing your value proposition. You had some great examples of people being really clear about their skills and capabilities and what they have to bring to offer. And then a personal interest of mine is, especially if you serve in management today, is really learning and studying how to be a good governor. And a way to do that is through not-for-profit board service. That's how I cut my teeth in governance. I spent the bulk of my career helping my clients run their businesses, and then having the privilege to lead and run businesses for Deloitte. And so that mindset shift around governance and how you coach, counsel, advise, question, challenge without doing that in not-for-profit board service can be a great way to cut your teeth.
Yeah, good advice. And we'll put a link into that, your Center for Governance in the podcast as well. Thanks so much. You've been listening to Janet Foutty, the Executive Chair at Deloitte. This is Dean Tobias with the Reboot Chronicles. I want to thank you for joining us today. Take care.